Hey class, welcome to Unit 1.3D. We're going to be focusing on the price elasticities of supply. All right. Now for this one, I really feel, and historically speaking, the data's there. Students tend to struggle more with the price elasticity of supply than they do with all other elasticities. And the reason being is because of the perspective that must be adopted. You need to take the perspective of the producer. Now, because we're high school students, we've been consumers our whole life. So to take the perspective of the consumer, it's fairly intuitive. But when it comes to taking the perspective of the producer or the supplier, just because we don't have as much experience to draw from, it requires a little bit more thought and a little bit more effort. So we are going to practice a lot more with this in class. So for the sake of the video, and so as to not waste any of your time, we're just going to get into the nitty-gritty of the price elasticity of supply. So what is the price elasticity of supply? Very similar to the other elasticities. Price elasticity of supply is a measure of a percent change in the quantity supplied of a good over the percent change in the price of that product. Now, when we're talking about the price of the product, we're taking the producer's or supplier's perspective. So we're taking into consideration the cost to produce that product, not the cost to consume the product. That would be the consumer's perspective. All right, so it's important to keep that in mind. All right, so it's important to note also that when we're talking about price elasticity of supply, we're referring to an upward sloping supply curve. We're not referring to a downward sloping demand curve. So most of the coefficients you get here will be of positive value and not negative value, but we'll get into that here in a second. All right. The main things you need to be aware of in the context of the model is that to illustrate an inelastic supply line, the supply line must intersect the x-axis or the q-intercept. So this would be a great example of an inelastic supply line, or a supply line that represents inelastic supply. If we're looking to illustrate a supply line that shows elastic supply, then we're going to originate that line from the y-axis, or the p-intercept, our price intercept, as you can see here. This would show an elastic supply. If we want to show a unit elastic supply line, then we must start our line from the origin here. This would be unit elastic. Now, it doesn't matter really what the angle is for unit elastic. As long as it starts out from the origin, it is going to be unit elastic. Why? Because remember, elasticity is not a measure of slope. Slope is a percent change in slope is change in quantity over change in price. It's rise over run. If you can see here, elasticity is percent change in quantity supplied over percent change in price. And if you begin in the origin, you'll find that the percent increase in quantity supplied will be proportionate to the percent increase in price. All right, so that gives us unit elasticity from the origin. All right, so this covers the basics in terms of the formula. I should have worn a belt today, very obvious now. Shows the basics of what it is via the formula. It shows the lens through the model. But now let's look at what causes a product to have either inelastic supply or elastic supply. Let's look at the determinants. All right, so just like can't talk and spell at the same time. Just like price elasticity of demand had determinants that determined whether the good had elastic demand or the product had inelastic demand, we have those for price elasticity of supply as well. So the very first determinant of the price elasticity of supply that we'll cover is the length of time. All right, so length of time. That's going to be the very first one. So if you think about it, the more time, for length of time to do what? The length of time to produce a greater quantity or a greater amount of your product. All right. So if you have to increase the amount of supply you're selling to your customers right this second, then the supply is most likely to be very inelastic. The reason being, you don't have time to acquire other factors of production. You don't have time to hire more labor. You don't have time to build new distribution centers. You don't have time to build new retail outlets in a foreign consumer market like China. That would be the products market, by the way, in the context of the circular flow. But anyway, the length of time will have a big impact on whether the supply of the product is elastic or inelastic. So, for example, if we're talking about if we're talking about a change in demand that is immediate, right now, there's a shift in demand. The suppliers will not have enough time to satisfy that new demand right now. So quantity supplied probably won't change very much. It's going to be very, very, very inelastic in what we call market time. Also known as the immediate short run. It's also known as the immediate short run, right now. If you don't have that much time to hire new labor or get other resources, the price is increasing due to an increase in demand, you're not going to be able to supply a greater amount of the product very readily because you don't have much time to get those inputs together for the production. That's an immediate short run. But what about what we call short term? In the short term, all but one of your factors of production, I apologize. In the short run, only one of your factors of production can be changed, okay? So if you see that there's an increase, like if you own a donut shop and you see that there is a decrease in the demand for donuts, and you're seeing this happen over a period of a few weeks, well, from that, you could see probably that your revenue is not enough to cover your investment expenditure, so you might lay off a worker or lay off 2 workers in order to adjust for the change in the market. So that will enable you to lower your costs. It might bring down the quantity you supply to the market, but in doing so, because of less demand, you're actually achieving market equilibrium. All right, so that means the market is becoming efficient. All right, because you're letting go a particular resource that you don't need to satisfy consumer demand. So that's in the short run, okay? In the long run, all of your factors of production can be changed. You can replace all of your labor. You can relocate your headquarters to another geographic location. You can relocate all of your distribution, all of your manufacturing, all of your warehouse for extra inventory. You can move all of those things, all right, because you have a whole lot of time to do it. All right, now this, as you might be able to see, depending on the complexity of the market, that is what will dictate actually the chronological time. When we're talking about time in economics, we're not really talking about days or years or minutes, things like that. We're talking about how much time is necessary to move around to change the factors of production. Now, the answer to that is going to be different depending on the complexity of the market. If you own a pet rock business, then it's going to be very, very easy and very, very quick, very fast, immediate almost, for you to adjust to change in demand. If there's an increase in demand for pet rocks, what do you have to do to increase the quantity supplied to meet that new demand? You just have to go outside and pick up some rocks and sell them to some gullible consumer out there who's willing to look at a rock the same way they would a dog. Ooh, look at my pet rock. That's really easy to adjust to. But what happens if there's an increase in the demand for jet airliners? Well, now you're talking about a much more complex market, maybe an oligopolistic market or maybe a monopolistically competitive market. And as a consequence, there's going to be longer periods of time, like maybe months, things like that, to put or to adjust to that new increase in consumer demand. So therefore, the price elasticity of supply for the pet rock, because of the time issue, pet rocks would have a very elastic supply because you can adjust to demand very quickly. Whereas airliners would have a very inelastic supply because it would take a much longer time to produce those products to meet the new consumer demand. So that's just one determinant. Yeah, we got a long ways to go. Another determinant Another determinant of the price elasticity of supply is the mobility of the factors of production. See, the mobility of the factors of production. So if you think about Apple, for instance, Apple is a very, very large company. Apple has headquarters in the United States, and they have headquarters in China, and I think they have headquarters in Ireland or something, but they have headquarters around the world. They have different regional headquarters. They also have warehouses in different parts of the world. They have distribution centers in different parts of the world. So they can store inventory in America, they can store inventory in China, they can distribute throughout China and America. They have retail outlets in China and America. So if they want to increase the quantity supplied of iPhones and iPads in the Chinese consumer market, all they have to do is allocate more of those products to those retail outlets that they already have built. As a consequence, the price elasticity of supply for Apple, for the mobility of Apple's products and the factors of production, more importantly, the mobility of the factors of production, is very easy to do for Apple because they've already laid the groundwork. They already have that infrastructure established in the different consumer markets like China and the United States and Europe. However, a company that is local, that is trying to become international, let's say in Denton, Texas, there's a local regional company called Morrison Corn Kits, and they produce like cornbread mix, pancake mix, but they only sell those products regionally to like Oklahoma consumers, Texas consumers, Louisiana consumers. They don't have a lot of demand in the Chinese market, for instance. So if Morrison Corn Kits wanted to access the consumer markets of China, it would take them a lot longer period of time to be able to increase the quantity supplied of their products to China because they don't have any factors of production there. They would have to establish them there first before they can then increase the quantity supplied. That's not the case for Apple. So therefore, Morrison's Corn Kits would probably have a much more inelastic supply due to the inability or the lack of the ability to make their factors of production mobile. Right. Another determinant is spare capacity. Another determinant of price elasticity of supply is spare capacity. All right. So let's go back to let's go to a donut shop, okay? Let's say you serve 50 customers per week on average. And back in your store, you have in your closet of your donut shop, you have flour, you have eggs, you have icing, you have all the things necessary for the production of donuts. But let's say there's all of a sudden there's an increase in demand for donuts for whatever reason. You go from, on average, 50 customers a week to about 100 customers a week. Do you have enough spare capacity of resources from which to utilize to produce more donuts, a greater amount of donuts, to satisfy the increase in demand from your customers? Probably not. If you don't have a lot of storage capacity, then you're not going to be as responsive to the desires of your customers. The amount that you're going to supply to them is not going to be very much in relation to the increase in price that you're going to be charging them. All right? Whereas, let's say you have a massive storage facility at your donut store. You have 10 times more flour than you did previous. And so as a consequence, you can be much more responsive to your customers. And so if you see that demand is rising for donuts, you're able to adjust and provide a much greater quantity of donuts to your customers because you have the storage capacity for those factors of production, and that is what will prevent you from having to raise the price too much for your customers. Again, I'm sure you have questions about this. Well, let's save this for class, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty in class. All right. What about the ability to store inventory? What about the ability to store inventory? All right, what happens if there's an increase in demand for donuts? Well, if the donut store has a whole lot of donuts sitting in the back of the store, well, they can very, very quickly adjust to the change in demand. So therefore, they don't have to increase the price on their consumers very much. All right, but if there's no inventory, then the producer will be inclined to raise the price for the consumer in order to earn more revenue so they can reinvest that revenue into more resources and more donuts so they can adjust to the change in demand in the future. All right, so again, going back to time. Time's a big concern when it comes to producers. All right, what's next? Okay, so I think that's where we're going to stop it for now for price elasticity of supply. We'll probably get into more details and get more examples in class. So hopefully this will satisfy your needs right now. Go ahead and finish reading the section in the textbook and then move on to the video check just to assess your understanding of these concepts. All right, I'll see you guys in class. Have a good one.